Today I'm speaking with Willie Sage. Willie and I have been mates since around 2006, and he is someone that I've always been able to speak honestly with on any subject. He's my guinea pig for this experiment, so for that I'm very grateful. Experiment or not, Willie deserves to be here. He would be best described as a bit of a character and someone with irrepressible energy who you know instantly when he's around. He's had an incredibly varied career and life alongside his long-suffering wife Jane. I went to see him and spent some time at their stunning place on the west coast. I've been instructed by the locals to say just how horrible the weather is over there and that there's absolutely nothing to do, so no one should bother heading over that way. I hope you find this interesting. Can we start off with just have a look at that wee picture there. So can you just tell everyone who that is?
Well, that was me when I was probably 18.
Okay.
And
Who was it painted by?
it was a photo that my dad took, and then my mum did the painting.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that was when I suppose my whole life was just about sheepdogs and shearing and hunting and fishing, and that was pretty much it, really. Yeah.
You left school quite early, I think.
Yeah, 14 I left school. Sort of at the end of primary school. We had a local primary school up the road from where we lived in a district out the back of Taiapi called Pukioka. It was a pretty cool little school. Great teacher. We went all the way through to Form 2 back in those days. And then we were supposed to go off to boarding school because all our friends with farms had sent all their kids to boarding school. My mum and dad had gone to boarding school, and I was booked in at Nelson College from the day I was born, I think. But as that day got closer,
You started trembling a wee bit.
I was pretty terrified about that. And yeah, Mum and Dad decided, I wasn't keen to go. So they decided to put us on correspondence. So we went on secondary correspondence, which we started in the third form. And I did a reasonable amount of the third form, but there was just other things to do, catching possums, going hunting.
So what were you like as a person then? Because I think anyone, that knows you now would think of you as a fairly outgoing sort of personality. You're sort of the life of the party sort of person, or at least that's how you come across.
Yeah, no,
What were you like back then?
I was pretty shy, and yeah,
Which I think a lot of people would find quite hard to believe.
Yeah, I just like spending time on my own, really. I was used to just being on my own. I was pretty unconfident in the big wide world, mainly because I didn't know about it and it was scary. I couldn't even drive down the main street of Taiapi without really not knowing who to give way to, let alone go to a big city like Palmerston. So, yeah, it's just unconfident with that sort of thing. Very much so.
Obviously, somewhere between then and now or sometime in the future, you've learnt to gain that confidence. How did you learn that? Was that something that just came by accident, or did you actually decide, well, I need to learn how to interact with people better?
I think you've got to put an effort in to learn it. I think for me it was about proving that I wasn't, a shy, recluse, not very special person, and I decided that I would prove to people that I could be.
Why? What was the trigger to make you decide that?
I suppose I wanted to do something to prove to people that I was a bit special. I never thought I would ever be a pilot. I was always fascinated with, watching the top dressing planes, watching the guys flying the venison helicopters, it just fascinated me, and it was something that but I never ever once thought that I could do that. Yeah, well, when I decided to get my PPL, many years ago, my family set up a whitewater rafting company on the Rangatiki River, and I got involved in that. And we used to use helicopters to fly people up to the headwaters of the Rangatiki and use them for other bits and pieces. And I had a guy who was working part-time, Peter Davies, who was working part-time as a raft guide, and he was a wannabe helicopter pilot back in those days, loading for John Anderson in Taiapi. And he had got his commercial helicopter license. He had done a fixed-wing PPL, and then his helicopter license. He told me, if you want to learn to fly helicopters, you're better off to do some fixed-wing flying first. Get your PPL and then credit those hours, and it'll make your helicopter license a bit cheaper. And I'd always thought that doing, pilots must be pretty smart people, to pass all those exams and fly those amazing machines. But anyway, I'd saved up a bit of money from my shearing and decided that that's what I was going to do. And that was about the time that I first met Jane, and I think she was giving me a bit of a push along with a bit of confidence to say, hey, you probably could do this, whereas I would have gone, oh, man, I can't do that, I'm just...
So you were 20 or 21 at the time? Or?
21, 22, I think, pretty young.
Yeah.
And she sort of gave me the confidence to have a crack at it. So I started doing the flying, and I wasn't confident, but I battled my way through. But the exams were the thing that freaked me out back in those days. When you did a private license, it was one big exam, so the 4 or 5 subjects chucked into one. And I studied, but I'd never done an exam before. We never did.
Even at school?
No, we didn't do exams at primary school, and I never did them at secondary school. So that was all, pretty freaky. So every time it came to the exam, I'd just be absolutely nervous, and we used to go up to Rotorua and sit them up there. I sat that exam 3 times.
The PPL exam?
Yeah, and you had to pass all the subjects, because if you failed one, you had to do the whole thing again. And, navigation and stuff like that was just... It wasn't that I couldn't do it, but I didn't read the questions properly and find I'd finish the exam and then turn the page and there'd be still some more to go, and shit. And I remember coming out of there in tears one day, just thinking, I really want to do this, but it's just too hard.
And did you ever get to the point where you thought, I can't do this, or was it something you were going to do if you had to do it a dozen times?
Well, I finally battled through, and I did. I passed the exam on the 3rd time. And but then I thought, commercial license, that's just a step too high. So, and at that stage, and I went through and got my private license and did a bit of private flying, but money was pretty tight in those days. We'd just had Jess, he was a new baby, and I was shearing, and didn't really have the money to carry on and do my helicopter license. So that was sort of put back on the back burner, really, and it was more a case of survival in those days. So that's sort of as far as it went for a few years.
So just getting back to the confidence thing, I guess passing the PPL exam gave you some level of confidence that you could do it.
A little bit, not a lot, because I'd battled through, and it wasn't easy. But the flying thing was a little bit put on the back burner there for a bit.
There's people who, struggle with confidence. I know I'm like this a lot. And I think it really holds people back, in life. There's a lot, maybe more you could do if somehow you could learn to overcome this. Even I think, you're still inside, you might feel a lack of confidence, but you've learned enough to portray a sense of confidence to others.
I think the biggest thing that holds people back is the influence of society or the peers that they're with, saying what they should and shouldn't do with their lives. I mean, if you're in a certain peer group, whether it be, getting a stable job, getting a mortgage, getting married, having kids, or, sticking at a job for a certain time and progressing up, that pressure is pretty immense. And to have the guts to step out of that and go, hey, there's stuff that I want to do, and I'm going to do it because I really want to do it, is hard for people to do. And that's what, I've been lucky, and I think, ever since I did get confidence to realise, hey, I can do anything I want. It ain't that hard. Once I learnt that barrier, that whatever I did, I could do it well, the sky was the limit. And also not having the fear to go, well, actually, we want to go and do that. And everyone's going, what are you doing that for? You're chucking in, whether it be your job at Air New Zealand or your stable job that you got somewhere else, to go and do that. Why would you do that? Well, because I want to. And it's an adventure. And the amazing thing is when you do that and you go with a positive attitude, it always works out. It really does. But I think 90% of people are too scared to do that.
Because of what they fear other people will think of them.
Yeah, the pressures. Yeah, whether it could be something like staying on the family farm or running the family business or carrying on a job that your parents, thought you should do. It's stepping out and doing that. And whatever you do, if you have the confidence to do it, it'll work out fine. Yeah. I think that's what I learned.
Yeah.
And not looking back and going, hang on, did I make the right decision? Or I've got these two opportunities, which is the right one? In a lot of ways, it doesn't matter. Pick one and run with it and be positive about it, and it will work out. Don't look back and go, oh, if only. Over the years of flying, I have so many people that'll sit in a plane or a helicopter with me and go, this is so cool. I wanted to be a pilot, but I couldn't because I got married, or it got expensive, or I didn't have the confidence to do it. And I think that's sad, because you could have.
And did that sort of happen suddenly, or at a certain point in your life, or did it take 5 or 10 years to get to this point?
I think it grew when I started getting into in those earlier days, I was, basically doing farm stuff, shearing, mustering, doing that sort of stuff. And then we got involved in the rafting, and my brother, he was very confident and he was very outgoing and he could do that stuff easily, and I couldn't. I was just a bit reserved. But in the end, I thought, nah, bugger it, I'm going to force myself to do this. So I ended up getting into the rafting as well.
The guiding, yeah,
as a guide, and made myself be that outgoing, confident person, even though I was absolutely terrified of it. And when I started doing it, the confidence grew, and I realised, hey, actually, I'm not too bad at this. And I think that gave me a bit of confidence to start moving on with other stuff, to say, yeah, I can do this. But that was a very hard thing to do. It wasn't easy. It was
taking that step to give it a go.
Yeah,
wasn't easy.
Yeah, and feel that other people were looking at you and thinking, shit, he's not going to do any good at this. He's not the right person to do that.
Yeah. So what you're saying is you actually have to take a bit of a leap of faith at some point and give something a go.
You definitely have to take a leap of faith. Yeah.
You talked about being a musterer and a shearer and a rafting guide. What else did you do before becoming a pilot?
We moved to Rotorua, and I got a job up there at a place called, it was Rainbow Springs initially, and they set up a big tourist farm across the road, which was in competition to the world famous Agrodome, which was further up the road. So I helped develop that, and I just went in there as I was just the bum boy, really. I wasn't going to be doing shows. I was just going to be cleaning doing the cleaning and stuff. But I thought, oh, hang on a minute, I reckon I could make a go of this. You know, I had the ability to be able to work the dogs and shear the sheep. So we started setting up the show, and there was a few other people there as well who were employed as show people, even though I wasn't. But as it got closer, we started developing the show, and as it got closer and closer to the day, I think the general manager could see that I actually had a few skills here that were quite good. And so as it turned out, when we had this great big opening, and he came to me a little bit before, to everyone else's disgust, and said, do you think you could do the show on the opening day? And I said, yeah, I could do that. And so that went from there. And within a couple of years, I was actually managing the whole thing.
So all these front men who had been preparing for this moment for months were sort of relegated to backstage, were they?
Yeah, I think I realised I had some quite good skills there, whether I had them naturally. And I mean, I was lucky because I knew how to, you know, work dogs and shear sheep well, which was a big advantage. And then I suppose the rafting had taught me a few personal skills, you know, with dealing with people and being outgoing. So
can you give us a little demo of what you used to do there?
Oh, I think I'd be too embarrassed.
You've just been telling us all how confident you are.
But going on from that story, we were there for 3 years, and that developed that Rainbow Farm into a very big tourist operation. And the Agrodome down the road, which was world famous for its Godfrey Bowen and Ivan Bowen and the 19 different breeds of sheep, they had a show that was a little bit outdated, and we brought quite a bit of sort of motivation and sort of excitement for the people coming into the show. So we got them up and going, audience participation, and it was going really well. And it got to the stage where Rainbow Farm Springs was about to buy out the Agrodome, and they were going to buy them out and close them down, take them over and close them down and be the number one show. And just before they were in the process of negotiating that deal, and just before that happened, I happened to go down to the Agrodome because they had a sheepdog down there that, or I had a bitch, and that I was going to take my dog down to get it in pup to them. And I went down and saw Paul Bowen down there, who was Godfrey Bowen's son, and they had been our arch enemies, and we were basically on a mission to crucify them. So I went down and saw Paul down there, and it was a time when, it was in the 80s when the farming recession was really hitting. So farming was in a pretty shitty place. And I remember talking to the guy who ran it there, Max Martin. He wasn't a bad guy, but he did treat you a little bit like, you know, I don't know, we were down here because we were the farm boys and he was the big GM. And I remember him saying to me, it was about a week before, saying, well, you're pretty lucky to be here, aren't you, really? What else would you be doing in these economical times? And I thought, geez, Max, you know, it sort of hurt me a bit, really. And I got down talking with Paul, and we started talking about different stuff. And he said, why don't you come down here? If you come down here,
to the Agrodome.
Yeah, you could help me redesign the show. And, you know, because it's the world famous Agrodome, and I know we're struggling. You guys are about to buy us out. But if you came down here with some ideas, we could give this a kick in the guts, and we could beat those guys because, you know, Godfrey's passionate about this. You know, he's passionate about his shearing and his 19 different breeds of sheep. And he said if it went under, it would kill him because they're more of a commercial operation. I went back and talked to Jane about it. And we said, why don't we do that? And Paul had offered me no more money or anything like that. And I thought, wow, that would be a challenge. Shall we do that? So we just decided, let's do that. I mean, it was the craziest thing to do. They were about to go under. We were about to buy them out. I was the manager of this place, sitting pretty sweet. And let's do it as a challenge. So we did it, and of course, man, that didn't go down too well at all. But we went down there within 2 years. We'd changed the Agrodome, and we vitalised the whole thing, and it was just booming. We put them out of business.
Really?
Yep. Rainbow Agrodome's still going. Rainbow
Nice
Farm's
guy.
gone. And I still remember poor old Max, he died a little while ago, but was saying, mate, you know, you're lucky to have this job. What else would you be doing in these economical times? If he hadn't said that to me, I probably wouldn't have done it. But I thought, stuff you. And that was another move of going, I mean, it was a crazy thing to do, but I thought, what the hell, let's do it. And it was a great thing. It was pretty cool. And, you know, Paul Bowen's a great friend of mine to this very day.
Just going back to the exams thing, I think this is something we're probably maybe getting better as a society now, is recognising that, you know, different people, different kids learn in different ways. What do you think about, you know, exams and forcing people to pass exams, or having, you know, other practical ways of assessing someone's ability? And specifically in aviation, you know, are exams still a good way to assess someone's ability to get a CPL or an ATPL?
Yeah, well, when I decided that I'd sort of got a bit more confidence over the years, this was after 6 years in Rotorua, and I suddenly thought, maybe I will have a crack at this commercial license. And that's Nelson Aviation College was up and running by then. This was 1990. Wally Wangdendonk was running it then, and I knew you could go down and do the 4-week course or 6 weeks or whatever it was and do all your subjects. So we decided that we'd do that. So we actually took all that time off and packed up our old trusty Holden, Kingswood, headed down to Motueka with a Jess who was about 5 or 6 then, I think. And I enrolled at that course to do the theory, and I was pretty scared of, you know, I thought, I don't know how this is going to go, you know, after my track record, I'm just not sure how it's going to go. And back in those days, they had a week course for people who had been out of school to do things like fractions and a bit of maths and stuff. So I did that first week, and I just found once I was in that classroom and they were explaining how to do things, I suddenly realised I can actually do this. This isn't that hard. And then we went through the theory course, doing all the all the theory for the exams, and there was 30 of us, 35 of us in there. Most of them were quite, other than of course the helicopter guys who weren't that smart, but all the fixed wing guys were, you know, well educated. And I remember through the course saying, why are you struggling with that, mate? It's not that bloody hard. And they explained it really well, and I studied hard. I'd put my effort into the course all day and go home and swat all night. But I remember when we went through the exams, I was one of the few who blitzed the whole bloody lot of them in one hit. And once I did that, I just went, wow, I can do this. You know, this isn't that hard.
So does it come back to that confidence thing again?
It was definitely confidence, and once I'd learned how to, you know, read the question and do the stuff that they explained to do in such a good way, yeah, I thought, wow, I can do this. The question is that helpful to your flying? Well, I don't know if any of the theory I've done over the years has been helpful in any way. But does it show that someone has the ability to get stuck in and do the work to pass something, even though most of it's pretty irrelevant to what you do when you fly? Yeah. But it does show that you have the ability to knuckle down and, you know, put the effort in.
Yeah, I think maybe in a lot of ways it's like a university degree. You know?
Exactly.
It shows that, yes, I can, as you say, knuckle down, but what you learn there is not necessarily what you're going to use in your career.
No, but does that matter? Yeah.
You passed your exams, you got your CPL. What was your first flying job?
Well, see, I'd never wanted to fly aeroplanes, really. It was all about helicopters. But I soon realised that paying that money for a helicopter licence, we were on the bones of our arse for years, so that was just out of it was just out of the equation, really. I mean, I was really lucky. I learnt to fly in Taupo with a guy, Arthur Whitehead. He died not that long ago having cancer. And they ran Air Charter Taupo, which flew all the hunters into the Kaimanawas. And he was an amazing instructor, really good bush pilot. And right from the time that I did all my training with him, my PPL, all through to the commercial.
Okay.
So right from the time that I first flew, we were doing stuff in the mountains, going out and landing in a 20-knot crosswind, doing bad weather flying through the hills. I did a mountain flying course before I'd finished my PPL, flying through the Kaimanawas. And that stuff that he taught me back in those early hours still sits with me today, those initial basic stuff, whether it be picking where the wind is, avoiding turbulence, escape routes out, all that stuff was embedded in me right from that early time before I even got my PPL.
And that sort of comes back to what we were talking about this morning, is that having quality training early on is so important, and maybe what's, lacking a lot these days.
Yeah, it's sad. I fly with a lot of guys who have recently got their commercials and maybe done a bit of instructing and might have 1,000 hours or so, and I feel really sorry for them because they've spent a lot of money getting a commercial license, maybe instructor rating, multi-engine instrument rating, and yes, they've definitely ticked the boxes, but they haven't actually learnt really how to fly. And it's a pity because it's not, you can learn all that stuff as you go. How do we fix that problem? Well, I know it's not because the instructors are low time, because just because they're low time doesn't mean they don't have the ability to teach well. It's just they haven't been taught well. So everything that they're taught, which is unfortunately not much, gets passed on. I mean, I flew with a young guy the other day who's just got a job with a local operator, and we were doing some mountain flying. And nothing too full on, but he'd never flown down below the hills or taught to fly up a valley. We were doing some crosswinds, and I said, have you landed in a crosswind? He said, if the wind was above 5 knots, we would never go out. So he's never landed in a crosswind. So we were teaching him how to land in a crosswind, which he actually picked up and did pretty well. And by the end of it, he was absolutely fizzing. But he'd never been shown that. And it's going all the way through now. You see it in the airlines. The airlines are taking on these people, and they've never landed in a crosswind. They've never really been able to fly visual approaches. It's all been on numbers. And so you see with the airlines now, they're not letting their pilots fly a basic circuit because they're cocking it up and it's too dangerous, or they're cancelling the flight because there's a little bit of crosswind. I mean, that never happened 20 years ago, and it's not because it's dangerous. It's just that these people they haven't ever done it. And once
the problem is when too many of these procedures come into place, I think there's a perception by young pilots and maybe general public that these things are dangerous.
Yeah.
The visual approaches are dangerous and shouldn't be done, whereas in the past that wasn't the case. It's just over time these ideas creep in.
Yeah, well, it may be if you're flying a big heavy jet internationally from one ILS to another, that's the way you do it. But when you're flying a turboprop around New Zealand, that doesn't really work. You need to be able to join the circuit. And I mean, it's the sort of thing you'd think you learnt before you went solo. Being able to look out the window and join a circuit quite safely.
You may be right, but it's quite a difficult problem to fix, isn't it? And I know one thing I've always thought that is done well in the Air Force is that someone who's got a lot of experience goes back instructing maybe at the end of their career or, well into it. But that's not the way it is in GA or in the civil world, because there's no money there.
Yeah, well, it is a big problem. I mean, I've got no answers for it other than the fact that if you got those initial instructors and put them through some good basic training, whether it be crosswind training, bad weather, VFR flying, mountain flying, which isn't a huge thing. I mean, we have a mountain flying syllabus in our CPL, but that might mean, taking off from Motueka on a lovely day like today, climbing to 6,000 feet, landing at Karamea, taking off and flying back and ticking the box. Well, that's not mountain flying. So, yeah, I mean, CAA have tried to address it by saying, hey, that's what we need to do.
But I think it has made, a noticeable impact in the accident statistics. So you went to work at Air Charter Taupo?
No, my first job was at Mountaineer, Ruapehu.
Okay.
National Park, based a little airstrip right at the bottom of the road that turns off going up to the Chateau Tongariro. Yeah. And how I actually got that job, Keith McKenzie, who owned Mountaineer and who was a helicopter operator in Tamaranui. I mean, jobs were hard to find back in those days because there wasn't a lot of movement. But I'd had a bit of a brainwave because at the Agrodome I dealt with a lot of the tour drivers and we used to have a lot of tour buses come through back in those days. And I personally knew all the drivers pretty well. They'd come and watch the show and would have smoko with them. And I could see potential for doing scenic flights over Mount Ruapehu. I knew it was a real untapped resource, but I also knew that tourists had no time. They're on these coach tours. They'd leave Auckland, Waitomo, Rotorua, blast all the way down to Wellington, get on the ferry down the South Island, off they'd go. There was no time, 10-day tour of New Zealand. So they didn't have time to stop at Taupo or Turangi or any of those places and do a scenic flight. But I thought, gee, if we could actually have those coaches call in at, say, Turangi, and then we picked them up, flew them up over the mountain, the coach carried on further south. And there was a cafe down there south of Taiapi called Flat Hills, who I knew the guy who ran it. He was an ex-shearing contractor, and there was a big airstrip there. And I thought, well, and the coaches all stopped in there for their lunch. I thought, wow, if we could actually pick those people up, whiz them up over, the ones who wanted to fly, do a trip over National Park, and then meet them at the other end. It's not going to take any time off. So I went to Keith McKenzie and said, Keith, I reckon I've got a good idea here. If you give me a flying job, I'm going to push this and we'll make it work. So Keith, sucking on his smoke, decided that was a good idea. But Keith always had he's a bit of an aviation enthusiast, and he always had a fascination about wanting to get bigger, brighter and shinier. And it was the time when Ian Nelson were expanding, and they had the Aztecs and the Chieftains, and they were just getting into the Saabs. And these Aztecs came up for sale.
Saabs or Metros?
It was when I think Air New Zealand bought them out, and they got the Saabs and the Metros. Oh, yeah. And they were getting rid of the Aztecs and the Chieftains that they used to fly people around in. And Keith, he decided he wanted one of these cool machines. So he decided that's going to be the machine for doing the job. And so he went and bought one of these things. And I had a brand new commercial, 200 hours, never flown a twin in my life. So we went and picked this aeroplane up, took it over to New Plymouth. Wayne Harrison was the...
Was it an Aztec?
Yeah, an Aztec. PIX, Pixie. And I went over there with Wayne Harrison, who was the CFI of the New Plymouth Aero Club. And he gave me a type rating in the old Aztec. And then we decided we're going to set up a little office at Flat Hills. So I built a little office. My dad came down and helped me, and we banged together a bit of an office down there. Had an airstrip down there. And I remember Keith, we used to have, there was no pay wave or electronics. So I used to have those zip-zap machines, remember him throwing me one of those zip-zap machines and all the little papers and a set of epaulettes and said, there you go, off you go. So that was me, brand new Aztec rating, down at Flat Hills, and I'm going to make this work. So the first 6 months, man, nobody wanted to know because it was something different and it was a bit disheartening. I'd hammer away at the drivers. Then I actually started getting a few guys interested because they went, no, we fly the glaciers. No, we go with air safaris. No, we use the helicopters. We're not doing anything new. Anyway, I managed to get a few of the guys to give it a go, and it started to take off. And the word got around, and so we ended up getting another Aztec. And then we ended up getting a couple of Islanders as well. So within 12 months, we had 2 Aztecs, 2 Islanders, 206 and a 172, and about 4 or 5 pilots. And we were going pretty good. We were cranking away, and it was going really well because it was a good flight. And, you had to get the weather right. And we always guaranteed the people that we would see the tops of the mountains, or else we'd give them their money back. And often it would be cloudy and Flat Hills or Turangi, whatever, so you managed to sneak up above the cloud and the mountains would be sticking out through the top.
You would be adamant you saw it and they would go,
no, we're pretty good. You got good at picking it after a while. But it went really, really well. It was good. And I was there for 4 years, and then we ended up moving. We were based at Flat Hills for a while. Then I ended up moving back up to the Chateau at Ruapehu. We bought a house up there, but we kept doing the same thing with the transfers, and it was going good. But it got to the stage where I'd done 4 years up there, and Keith's wife, Robin, bless her soul, she's a lovely lady, but it was just the days when QA started coming in, and she was real into this QA. And, it was a...
For what you say here, I've been a safety manager for many years.
I know.
Made a good income from it.
I mean, she had good intentions, but she used to do me head in. And I remember one day, she had some... the ideas were good, but practically they were shit. And I had a few run-ins with her. And I got to the stage one day where it was just getting a bit much. I remember Keith turned up at the airstrip in his helicopter, and I said, Keith, you and I have got to have a talk. So I said, come round the back. I said, Keith, Robin's doing my head in. All the stuff, it's driving me nuts. I'm trying to run a business here, get the job done. It's going really well, but she's just stifling it with all this crap. It's getting to the stage where I can't handle it anymore. Keith pulls out a smoke, lights a smoke, and says, well, how do you think I feel? I'm married to her. I said, oh, come on, Keith, she's not that bad. But anyway, it got to the stage where I thought, it's time to move on. And I'd heard about these great Cessna caravans that were flying across Cook Strait, and I thought, man, it'd be cool to have a go flying one of those. So I ended up going down there for a job interview with Sounds Air. Sounds Air, slightly different company back then to what it is now.
What year was this?
Would have been about 94.
Yep. This is before the days of single engine IFR.
Well before the days of single engine IFR. Yep. So we left Mountaineer, and we actually ended up moving back to Taiapi. We had a house in Taiapi, and I used to travel down and do 2 or 3 days with Sounds Air and travel back. I look back on those days, and Sounds Air actually got shut down by CAA soon after I started there. It was, when I started, it was after the Mount Robinson control flight into terrain accident.
Yeah.
And I was probably only there about 6 months, and CAA grounded Sounds Air.
And what were the sort of the key reasons for doing so?
Well,
and did you agree with them?
Back then I didn't.
You were a line pilot then?
Yeah, I was a line pilot. Back then I didn't, because the thing they shut Sounds Air down on were, they were minor things. But when I look back now, I mean, when CAA come in and they have to ground someone, they've got to find technical issues to do it. The reason they grounded them was they'd had a run of accidents and incidents, and VFR across Cook Strait on a regular schedule, when I look back now, was just crazy. You know, I didn't see it at the time, but it was. And
Perfectly legal, though.
Perfectly legal, but just too much pressure for pilots, staff. You know, you're either cancelling flights, upsetting passengers, or you're pushing on a weather that you shouldn't. You're having to fly in turbulence because you can't fly in controlled airspace. I mean, maybe some places a VFR scheduled run would work, you know, like in the tropics on a short island hop, but not across the meanest bit of bloody water like that.
So CAA, you know, they can't shut down a legal operation. Did they have other safety concerns?
Oh, there were safety concerns like, you know, weight and balance not being I mean, they weren't, I mean, they were technical issues, but they weren't probably what I would call safety issues, whereas the big safety issue was VFR across Cook Strait on a scheduled run. I mean, that was a safety issue, but like you say, technically that was legal. And saying that they pushed the weather at times, well, it was bloody hard not to. You know, I mean, halfway across the strait and the cloud's a bit low. You know, what do you do?
Weather's never black and white, is it? There's always a big grey area in between.
Well, when you VFR, it's definitely not black and white.
So how did Sounds Air claw out of that and get their certificate back? What were the changes?
Oh, well, they just got really strict with weather. But it almost made, you know, the pilots were petrified to bloody fly for a bit. So most of it was not a practical solution. I mean, at the time, Sounds Air were pushing and said, why don't you make this single engine IFR? And
this was a big thing that Cliff was pushing for.
Yeah, Cliff was pushing for it. And, I mean, he was right. Why didn't they? But it wasn't the time. It was too much of a step. It wasn't something that CAA could comprehend. So, you know, it was, yeah, okay, it would have been the answer, but it was never going to happen.
So it took a few years to really to get enough sway on to get the single engine IFR approved, didn't it?
Yeah, well, I ended up, jeepers, I don't know. I seem to start off in these jobs and then I finish up, I'm not quite sure how it works out, end up running the place. So I ended up being chief pilot and CEO and the whole bloody shooting box. And it was that motivation to think, I'm going to make this better. I think that we can make this better. So there was definitely a bit of a mood in CAA and with developing relationships with them instead of fighting against them, instead of, you know, arguing against them and saying, you guys are wrong, we're right, why can't you do this? We want to do that, it's not fair. I thought, well, if I can get along with these guys and go, hey, we can make this operation safer if we work together on that.
Specifically with
single engine
IFR.
Single engine IFR, yeah.
Do you think this, it took the Mount Robertson accident to make that happen?
Oh, I don't think that had a lot to do with it. Not really. I mean, the Mount Robertson accident was, you know, it was a controlled flight into terrain. It was, you know, it was obviously some funny weather, but it was a pilot error thing that possibly shouldn't have happened. Can I diverse back on?
No.
Just one thing that's come to mind, which is interesting. And I mean, I'm going to speak about this because I think it's important. Barry Vid was the manager of Sounds Air, general manager of Sounds Air when that happened. And the accident that happened in with Mount Robin, crashing into the mountain was by a pilot who they'd had problems with. And I remember Barry saying to me, he said, we had problems with that guy. I was going to take him offline. I wish that I had. And that has stayed with me all those years. And, you know, because I've been in charge of a lot of people and had the responsibility of, you know, making guys go flying or not making them go flying, that's always stayed with me. And if you have that gut feeling that you're not happy about someone or you're worried, you've got to act on it. It's no good thinking, oh yeah, but we, you know, that guy had issues. We should have done something about that.
And this applies not just to chicken training managers, but
to anyone.
I guess to owners of companies and
owners of companies to have the ability to sit back and listen to their staff. If your staff are trying to tell you something, you've got to listen to you, because it's very hard as a manager to get the whole story. You'll get one side of it, and it's very easy to get swayed on that side. But you've got to listen to all your staff. And if you can listen to them, and they feel that you've listened to them, and you've done something about it, you'll get massive respect. I mean, that is the key to SMS. If you've got an SMS system, and your staff are putting stuff into it, and it's getting addressed, and they've felt they're getting heard, it will work. But if there's just stuff getting put into there because it's ticking a box and nobody's doing anything about it, which I fear is probably a lot of them, people are going to give up, and it's a worthless system. So you've got to listen to your staff, and you've got to, you know, feel that they've heard you, either, you know, dealing with the problem or whatever. If you can do that and get your team behind you, you're indestructible then.
Can you just say what it was like when single engine IFR was finally approved? I mean, those of us that have flown single engine IFR and been involved with it, you know, it's nothing that special these days, because, you know, we've had it for 25 years nearly.
Yeah,
but it must have been pretty groundbreaking on that first flight.
It was pretty special. Yeah, it was.
Heading off into cloud, knowing that we're out of the weather, we've got height below us.
Yeah. Oh, it was great. I mean, we used to fly freight IFR all the time. Yeah. You know, at night in Christchurch and Nelson and Palmerston or whatever. So to be able to load some passengers on there and climb straight out of Wellington, out of the bumps, and you know, go across the strait was just absolute heaven. I mean, it was a lot of work getting that single engine IFR. We got the first 125s, was when 125 and 135 first came in. We had the first 125 certification. You know, that was ahead of Eagle Air or any of those outfits. And yeah, it was a lot of work, but CAA were good to deal with. You know, they wanted us to do it. They wrote the rule around the caravan. Since there, it's found that some of it wasn't quite as good as it should have been. But
we won't go there.
No, but
what about the? Sorry.
Yeah, and yeah, once we went single engine IFR, it was great.
What about the passenger appeal? Was there resistance initially, or did it take some time for people to become happy with us, or did most people not really know?
I don't think. Well, they definitely thought it was great because the flights were way more reliable and heaps smoother. Yeah. I don't find a lot of resistance to the fact that the aircraft's only got one engine. I don't know if a lot of people know, do they? I don't know.
Where do you think we are now, almost 25 years on from there? Is it, you know, there's still a lot of resistance in certain sectors to single engine IFR, even from experienced pilots. Why do you think that is, and do you think that'll change over time, or is it just the way it's going to be if you haven't been involved in it?
I suppose it's the way it's going to be if you haven't got if you're not involved in it. I mean, a lot of it's to do with people's agendas. If you're running twin-engine aircraft, you're always going to say that they're way better because you don't want someone coming in with a single-engine aircraft.
I mean, some people, genuinely believe that it's not safe and they wouldn't put their family on a single-engine plane, despite the statistics over many years.
And, I mean, maybe they're right, I mean, I've done probably a little more multi-engine than single-engine, but almost split in half. I've done a lot of single-engine, and I mean, there's a risk, isn't there? But there's a risk to lots of things. There's a risk to flying. There is a risk that in a bad situation that engine might stop, and the outcome will not be good. But there's also lots of other risks as well, and they are probably a lot higher than that one. But we do focus on that one. I mean, there was just recently a PC-12 accident in the States that happened, and they were all killed, but nothing to do with the engine. Year before that there was a King Air accident in the same place, nothing to do with the engine or the engines. So it is an issue, but it's not our biggest hazard out there. There's a lot more hazards, and often the biggest risk is the one that you don't see. I mean, a lot of those things we prepare for, we train in case that happens. We do hours and hours of training with engine outs on twins and singles, so if it does happen, I mean, it hardly happens. I mean, twin-engine aircraft, occasionally they'll shut one down. And, in your single-engine, there is a chance it could happen. And if it does happen, if the pilot's skilled, he should be able to get everyone back on the ground in one piece. Same with a twin. But there's a lot of mitigation there, isn't there, with trend monitoring and better maintenance and all that stuff to minimise that. There's a lot more hazards out there that we definitely need to look out for.
And I, in my role as safety manager at Sounds Air, in the past 6 or 7 years, I completely agree. There's heaps of hazards that on a day-to-day basis are way higher than the engine issue. Whether it be weather or intoxicated passenger, who's acting the goat, or any number of things which are a way higher risk. What about single pilot? There's a lot of business, corporate owners that are quite happy with single pilot, but they demand 2 engines. But often I think the pilot is more of a hazard than the engine at times.
Yeah. Well, there's always a chance that the pilot might cark it. I mean, I don't think that's ever happened. I mean, it's happened on a few private flights where people probably shouldn't be flying, but I don't think it happens on commercial flights. I think as single pilot, I mean, I do 2-pilot and single pilot. I find I'm a lot better pilot single pilot because you are a lot sharper. There's a tendency to rely on the other guy at times to a certain extent, with a bit of complacency coming in there. I don't know. I mean, in some situations, when you're dealing with especially charters and things, passengers, it's good to have 2 pilots because one can deal with the passengers. But if you have good systems, there's nothing wrong with single pilot. If the pilots are trained properly and your systems are good. I mean, I don't know. Statistically, is there any difference?
Not from the statistics I've seen. No, very similar accident rate.
Yeah.
Within a few percent. Can you talk about your time at Vincent Aviation, which, correct me if I'm wrong, you went to Vincent after Sounds Air? Maybe a brief stint at Eagle, wasn't it?
I went to Eagle, and that was because Sounds Air was pretty full on. I was the CEO and the chief pilot and everything else. And it was just, 24 hours.
Mm.
And I got to the stage where I just couldn't do it anymore. I had to go. And I thought maybe an airline job would be the answer, So, yeah. Can I tell you a little story about that?
Okay.
It's just come to mind. I remember I had when I was thinking about leaving. Mountaineer, I'd just done an instrument rating, and I put an application in with Eagle Air, and I had an interview, and I didn't get in because I was just a country hick, and I just didn't fit the criteria, and they asked me a whole lot of these questions that, normal pilots would know, but I didn't. So I got the no thanks, you're not cut out for this sort of stuff. And that I suppose it pissed me off. And I thought, that's it. I'm never going to apply for another airline job in my life. Bastards. That I would have been good for that job. I know I would have been, but no. So anyway, while I was with Sounds Air, towards the end of it, we were living in Blenheim. So I got to know a lot of the Eagle guys and knew them all pretty well. And they were saying, come and apply for it. I said, no, I'm not bloody applying. And as it turned, towards the end of it, they said, look, if you apply, you'll get through the interview. We'll give you a metro job in Blenheim. I said, I failed and I'm not going back to those bastards. Look, you'll be fine. It'll just be a, formality, which it sort of was. So they decided they wanted me then because they must have thought I was okay. So I took the job, and that was when they had Banderantes and Metro liners. So I got a job as an FO on the Metro liner in Blenheim. And that was good. I did it for a year. But I think I worked out that it probably wasn't for me. I mean, I could do it, and I didn't mind it. But it was probably... Yeah, I couldn't see myself, progressing. Back in those days, you went from the Metro and then you went on the 7-3 or whatever you did, I just couldn't see myself doing it. And then I'd had a little bit to do with Peter Vincent. And he had a good mate who was a engineer in Blenheim, guy called the name of Ian Garlick. And he came up to me one day and said, Pete's looking for he's got this contract up in Darwin, and it's going to be flying Kiwi troops through to East Timor. Would you be keen to do that?
And you said, that sounds like a bit of me.
And it was a bit like going from the Rainbow Farm to the Agrodome thing. Went back to Jane and said, what do you reckon? She went, it'd be cool to do that, wouldn't it? And so I went to Pete and goes, yeah, we'll do that. And that's all I knew about it. I didn't know what he was going to pay me or what it entitled. So I went back to the guys at Eagle and said, I just don't think this is for me. We're going to go to Darwin. And they go, what are you doing? All my mates, what are you doing? You're a fool. You've got your airline career all set up with Air New Zealand. And I said, mate, it's not for me. This is an adventure. Of course, they all told, you can't do that, mate. Don't do that. Why would you do that? And if I'd listened to the peer pressure, I wouldn't have done it. So we packed up and off to Darwin we went. Yeah.
So you were flying...
Started off with a Reams 406.
Yep.
Little unpressurised turboprop. And the contract was to fly from the military base in Darwin across to a place on Suai.
So this was in
East
early
Timor.
2000s?
2000, yeah. 2000, 2001. Just after when all the Kiwi troops had gone in there, when Timor had all turned to custard. So the Kiwis had a big contingent up there in a little village called Suai, which was on the eastern side of East Timor. And it had a little strip in there. It was about 1,000 metres long, I think. They'd taken Hercs in there. So that was the idea, to fly over there. It was about I was about 440 miles, and so we'd load up with gear with Kiwi troops, personnel, freight, food, all sorts of bits and pieces. We were doing pretty much a flight every day.
Single pilot or two?
Yeah, no, it was single pilot.
Yeah, just you.
For a start, it was. There was a couple of other guys up there before I started, and then they left, and then for a while it was pretty much me, just flying that 406 across there. And it was when probably a reasonable way into it when 9/11 struck, and that changed everything when that hit. I remember getting up in Darwin that morning before I went flying, and then seeing that on the news. And then from that day on, we were on the military base. Everything just changed, all the security and that just went bloody crazy after that. But so I did that pretty much for a year by myself. I think I flew 800 hours that year in that 406 going to and fro across the East Timor. It was pretty cool.
And what was the flying like, over on the East Timor side? Was the infrastructure and facilities what you...
Well, there was nothing there for a start. It was just a strip with a Kiwi base there. They had 3 Squadron was there with the Iroquois.
Were there IFR approaches or anything like that? Or?
There were, but they weren't proper ones. So, there wasn't an IFR approach. Weather was always pretty good.
I'm sure.
It was interesting flying in the tropics. I'd never flown in the tropics before, and I was terrified of all these big thunderstorms. You hear all the stories, but weather's pretty benign up there because you're so far close to the equator. There's no frontal activity, so it's all tropical blobs of stuff. Unless there's a monsoon, and then there's a bit of a blanket of it. But most of the time, you've got isolated areas of thunderstorms, and you just go around them, or if there's one over your airfield, you wait 15 minutes and it goes away and you land. So you just learnt not to fly into any clouds over there, basically. So once you got your head around that, it was pretty good. But it was great. We built up really good relations with the military, and we were basically treated as the military because we were on the military side of the airfield. In fact, every time we came into land, the tower used to say, like they say to the military guys, gear down 3 greens. Yep, no, we got them down. So, but they sort of treated us like we were military people.
Did you do buzz and brakes?
We did have a little competition in Suo who could do the best buzz and brake with the military guys, but that was sort of off the record. Of course, I never did that.
Did you get involved at all in the the unrest there? Did you see much of it, or?
No, but it was always there. We sort of things started vamping up a bit, and we got a Beech 1900. And we got the first Beech 1900 actually before Eagle got one, and then we started flying in that. So that was a 2-pilot operation, and we needed some more pilots to do that.
Were these New Zealand CAA approved this operation, or CASA?
CAA approved.
Yeah.
Yep, they approved it. They're pretty good too. And I never got shot at there, but a couple of the guys did. They were doing a run in there one day, and they'd landed, and someone must have snuck into the camp, fired a few shots. And I remember the guys telling me, they said, man, these shots just went bang, bang, and everyone just hit the deck, whoomfa, except these 2 guys. It's like if you go hunting into a block of land that's never been touched and nobody's ever shot at the deer, and you fire a couple of shots and the deer just stand there and look at you. You go into a place where the deer have been shot, you fire a shot, gone. Well, these guys were like a couple of deer who had never been shot at. They were just standing there. Well, the guy said, get down! And the guys went, holy shit! And they just jumped in the plane, started up, and buggered off home with no bullet holes in it. But yeah, I never got shot at, but there was always that potential, and everyone always had their weapons ready to go. Some pretty full-on stuff went on over there for sure. Yeah.
So do you want to just talk a wee bit about your time at Vincent? It was a Vincent Aviation, and Peter Vincent was a great little company, or not so little really, for a while there.
Yeah, well, it was just a little company when I never had anything to do with the New Zealand operation because I was Sounds Air and Eagle back then, but and the Australian one was just the military doing the East Timor run. That's all we did. We couldn't fly anywhere else in Australia because we only had a international AOC to fly into East Timor.
Right.
So when that started winding down and the Kiwi started pulling out, which would have been about 2004, I think, we were basically going to pack up and head home. And we had a couple of Beech 1900s up there then. And we were doing a little bit of international charter out of on our New Zealand AOC out of Darwin through to different islands in the Pacific and stuff, but we couldn't do anything domestically around Australia. So when it was all going to finish, another one of my stupid ideas, I said to Pete, why don't we get an Australian AOC and start doing charter stuff around here? So we did. So I got alongside CASA and developed an Australian AOC so we could operate in Australia. And I finished up being the chief pilot and everything else that goes with that too. Which seemed a good idea at the time. And all I'd ever heard about was dealing with CASA. They were just nightmares, just a nightmare to deal with. Anally retentive, it's all about rules, and they'd always say no. But I sort of developed relationships with them, and we didn't have any issues at all. We got our AOC up and running, and we were can do. We had good guys there, Kiwi guys and a few Aussies that we trained up, and we taught them to get the job done. We're the local airline up there, Air North. It was all a bit in the too hard. It was sort of, no, we can't do this. No, we can't do that because of this. Or there was always an issue. It was a bit. So people were getting a bit grumpy with them. So when Vincent turned up and go, can you guys do such and such? Yep, we can do that. When can you go? Now. So we'd wheel the plane out, chuck all the stuff in there, whack a flight plan in, and boff, we'd be away. And we started getting a name as being pretty damn good. And that upset a few of the local operators up there. But we were fizzing, and it was fun. It was a challenge. We were out there doing it and making some progress. And then there was a community quite a way east of Darwin and Arnhem Land called Groot Island, where a big mine was. And the local airline was running a scheduled run out there, but it wasn't going well. They were always cancelling flights, and they were getting a bit pissed off. So we decided, bugger it, we're going to set it up. So we set up running a Beech 1900 out there, and it went really well. Within a year or so, all our loads were full. We had a good schedule, and it was going really well. It was good. But I got to the point where we'd sort of done about 6 years up there, and I felt I wanted to come home back to New Zealand, just because, Darwin was a great place, and it was the culture was great, the people were great, but it wasn't a place I thought I could ever call home. So we decided we'll come back to New Zealand. So when I did that, it was a matter of trying to get somebody else in to run that operation up there, which turned out to be a bit difficult.
Finding people to take responsibility in senior roles, especially with CASA and CA, is not easy, is it?
It's not easy, and
I think especially in the environment we're in now, post-COVID, it seems to be doubly hard.
I don't blame people for not wanting to do those roles because, they feel that responsibility come on them. But, getting people in leadership roles to do well is the hardest task I've ever had to do. I've had great people working for me who have just been so good, as line pilots or training pilots. And then you think, man, they would be great. Let's give them the chicken training role or chief pilot role. And once that responsibility comes upon them, I'm not sure, they just start freezing up, I think, and I think they start worrying about themselves more than worrying about what they're trying to achieve. I mean, I try to tell them, guys, take your eyes off yourself, take your eyes on what you're trying to do, and do the best for the company and the people that are working there, and it will work out okay for you. But it's very hard to get them to do that. And a lot of them just get to the stage where they either get aggressive, or they just start saying no to everything or anything they think there might be the slightest bit of risk they won't do.
But the whole airline career and the prospect of flying a big silver aeroplane with jet engines is so enticing, isn't it?
Well, you can't blame them. I mean, these jobs that you take on, you know, especially for small companies and senior roles, are pretty demanding. I mean, the money's not as good. 24-hour, 7-day-a-week responsibility. Why wouldn't you go and work for an airline that's going to hopefully give you a stable job and a good roster? I mean, I can get it.
So let's turn that around. Why would you stay with a small company and do that? If you're giving advice to potential people that don't want to go the airline way, why should they stay?
Well, I think they've got to have a passion. They've got to have a passion for what they're doing, the flying that they're doing. They've got to have a passion for wanting to help other people, because that's a lot of what you're doing. I mean, when you're in an airline, it's more about you. You don't have anyone else to worry about. You've got no responsibility. You just do as you're told, which is not a bad thing if you want to just go to work and do your thing and then go home and do something else. But if you've got a passion to feel like you want to make change, but I mean, when people say, what should I do? I mean, I don't know. It's up to you, isn't it? I'm not saying that, either one is better than the other, because it's not. But I think both of them are really, really rewarding careers. But whatever one you pick, give it your best shot. If you go to an airline, don't be one of those airline people that bitches and moans about the company and the roster and had to do an extra duty. Be the positive one that go, man, this is a cool job. We get paid for doing this. I think that's the most important thing. Whatever you're doing, be positive about it. I mean, you can have two guys doing exactly the same job. One guy hates it. The other guy just loves it. What's the difference? The job isn't any different. We can talk ourselves into a job. We can talk ourselves out of a job. So my advice is, what should I do? Do what you want to do. And whatever you do, don't look back and have regrets and go, I'm going to do this and I'm going to make the best of it. I'm not going to be one of those negative people who look back and go, I wish I didn't go here, I should have gone there. Or I see guys, there's so many opportunities out there. They get a couple of airline interviews and they're going, oh, should I go on this plane or that plane, or should I go on there? But mate, just pick one and run with it and be positive, and it'll all work out for you. Don't look back and think you made the wrong decision.
And if I was to look back over what you've been saying over the last hour, from the Agrodome to Mountaineer to Sounds Air to Vincent, what stands out to me is you've actually stuck with them all for a few years and provided some loyalty and actually gone in, with the intention of making the place better.
Yeah, I think so. And reaching a point where you think that you've probably done what you've done, you've put your input in, and then it's time to maybe move on to something else. I mean, it's been disappointing because some of those companies, fell over soon after. I mean, that's a bit disappointing, but maybe that's just the way it is. I mean, things have their rise and fall. like the Roman Empire, I suppose, and when a small company gets to a point, it's very hard to continue to grow it or to keep it stable, and maybe they have their day,
Can we talk a little bit about rules and regulations in the current climate?
Mm-hmm.
Aviation's such a regulated industry and getting more so by the day. And I think airlines and airways or ATC are all going the same way. SOPs and procedures are becoming more and more regulated. Are all these rules required? And if you look at the big picture, are they a good thing for the industry?
I mean, you've got to have rules and you've got to have guidelines. I think the way we seem to deal with issues now, if there's something that goes wrong, an incident or whatever, the first thing we do is we put systems in place to ensure, and it's what is accepted, and if you don't do that, you haven't done your job properly. So if you're seen to be making a change, which is, hang on, we're going to make a rule so that can't happen anymore, that is acceptable as being the fix for it. But is it the fix for it? I mean, just by making another rule, does that then cause another issue down the track? So where do you stop? There's a lot of talk now about, hey, we need to get back to using common sense. Well, that's a pretty broad statement, isn't it? I mean, what is common sense? What is acceptable common sense?
And the problem, I think we're both great fans of common sense, but the problem is your common sense may not be mine.
Exactly.
And so there's no line in the sand, is there?
And the way people are, and nothing against young people, because, they're great, they're no different than what we used to be, but they're brought up in a very different mindset to what we are, and it's not their fault, it's just the way that it is.
How does someone who enjoys thinking outside the square and showing initiative and having a sense of, personal freedom, how does a person like that operate in today's environment and stay happy and positive?
Well, I think
is it even possible?
I mean, I've got a lot of friends who work in, as airline pilots, and they're all good guys, and jeepers, when you go and do stuff with them, they're pretty cool. But when they're in the airline environment, they're almost like there's nobody home. You've got to be able to shut yourself off and just do what's required and not question the rules and get on with it. That's how you deal with that.
And I guess my question is, are those rules required to keep aviation as safe as it is now, or are we going too far? Where are we headed as a society in terms of continual rule making, and is there any end in sight?
Well, I think there needs to be an end, because we're getting to the stage now where we almost can't do anything. There's always something that's going to trip us up, whether it be a defect on the aircraft, or someone who's feeling a bit sick, or the weather's not quite right, or we can't do that approach because the minimum is a bit low and we can't go round the other way. So it's got almost a bit laughable, when you see aircraft sitting on the ground and cancelling flights for no real safety reason, or doing missed approaches at aerodromes for no real safety reason. So it's almost got to the stage where the only way you're going to be able to fix it is just keep those bloody things on the ground. And it's starting to reflect quite badly with, you look at customer dissatisfaction. They're just so upset because flights are always getting cancelled, delayed, mucked around. It's almost getting to the stage where it's unworkable. So I don't know, do we have to get back to a reset?
Mm. I mean, I'm a bit of a fan of a lot of stuff that Elon Musk says and has done. I know he's got his quirks, but anyone who's achieved what he has in life is going to have some quirks. But one thing he says is that rules are very easy to add, but very difficult to delete. And he said, you get to a point where you're like Gulliver, tied down by 100 ropes, and you just can't move.
Mm.
And it's not until some great crisis, like maybe a war, that provides a reset.
Yeah.
And we haven't had a great crisis for a long time, and it almost feels a bit like we're Gulliver at the moment.
Well, we are, but you look at what's happening on the East Coast, with what's happened to those people up there, those farmers. I mean, suddenly all the compliance that they've had to deal with, whether it be fencing off streams or all the stuff that they've got to comply with, I mean, it just means nothing all of a sudden. It's survival mode. And, there'll be stuff going on. People are getting on and surviving up there, whether it be, loading generators and fuel and stuff into aeroplanes and helicopters and flying them up there, or just getting the job done, or getting out there and fixing the road without having the consultant look at it first and putting out 1,000 road cones. The job is getting done. It's getting done practically. It's getting done safely, but it needs to be done. And all the stuff that suddenly seems so important isn't important anymore. But we've made such an industry of safety and compliance that the people who are in that, and you can't blame them, it's their livelihood, security. I mean, the more stuff they can put on, the better it is for them, because it justifies their jobs. So how you tidy up all that stuff with consultants who, there's a roading project and the government have given you, $10 million to fix up a bit of road. And then the consultants go in there, and 12 months later it's cost $5 million in consultants before they start. So, well, hang on a minute, we can only do half the road now. That sort of stuff. That needs a reset. And whether these disasters like we've had on the East Coast help that, I'm not sure. Or do we revert back into that? But very hard to change, or very good for the government to go, well, we're going to get rid of all this bureaucracy and sort all this stuff out. Well, it doesn't work like that, man. Those people, you cannot dig them out. I mean, they are entrenched. It's thousands and thousands of jobs, big paying jobs. They're not going to go easily. Those people have the power. So I don't know. I mean, we'll have to eventually, but it could be a wee way away. I'm not sure. I'd like to think it's not.
We haven't talked at all about helicopter flying. And you mentioned before that you were told that it's important to learn to fly fixed wing before fling wing, which you did for financial reasons. And you said in an article in Aviation News that when learning to fly helicopters, so many things that were downright bloody hard in an aeroplane is just plain easy in a helicopter.
When it comes to bush flying, very much so. I mean, you don't have to learn to fly airplanes before you fly helicopters, but it is a way of keeping the costs down for sure. And it also, I think, teaches you how to, maybe work the radio a bit better and that sort of thing, possibly. But, I mean, I was lucky before I went to fly helicopters. I'd done a lot of bush flying in aeroplanes, so I was used to low-level ops and landing in pretty shitty places. And yeah, I'm a bit of a scaredy cat now when it comes to bush flying in a plane. I just find, with a helicopter, once you've touched the ground, that's normally the end of it, but in an aeroplane, this is where all the action starts.
What are the similarities between bush flying in a fixed wing and flying a helicopter?
Oh, they're pretty much, the same principles apply.
Because those that don't know much about helicopters think you just lift off and hover and fly away and land vertically, and it's all so easy.
Yeah, well, sometimes it is, but if you've got, a heavy load and you're landing in a tight spot, It's not, which mostly you are when you're doing commercial work and the wind's all over the place. So it's exactly the same thing of landing your aircraft. I mean, I'm talking about off-airport landings in aeroplanes, which, you know, as you well know, you and I did a lot of years ago, and it's very much the same. It's assessing your landing area, picking where the wind is, you know, picking all your decision points. I mean, it's no different. The only difference is in a helicopter, you're going so much slower. You can maneuver way, way easier. But the principles are no different.
You fly a lot of types of aeroplanes. Maybe in one day you might fly your maul, a helicopter, a caravan, a jet. How do you cope with that from a safety perspective? And is that something that everyone could do with the right discipline? Or how do people know their limits, you know, what they can and can't do? Because that to many people would be quite a risky thing to do.
I mean, most pilots, commercial pilots, will fly one type of operation and one type of aircraft, whether it be, you know, helicopter or scheduled airline work or whatever you happen to be doing. And you get really, really good at that. You know, you fly one type all the time or one type of operation where you're going to familiar places, doing familiar sort of work all the time. You get extremely good at that. But the danger with that is everything that you do is not that demanding or not a lot of... well, there's thought put into it, but all your actions and motive skills, even when you go to talk on the radio and your call sign comes out, where you go to select a radio frequency, where you go to set the power, where you look on the gauges, all that stuff, where you start the aircraft, it's flick, 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 I hit the starter bank, away she goes, turn her all on, do your briefs or whatever you're doing, and off you go. And it becomes very easy, but you're not actually using a lot of, would it be brain power, I suppose?
Mental ability.
Yeah, mental ability, because you get to a point where it's very, very easy and they go, man, that guy's great in that 185. Geez, he's a good pilot. Or, man, that guy's great at long lining. Or, gee, I've never seen a Hughes 500 pilot as good as that guy. They've all got one thing in common. What is it?
That's all they fly.
Well, they've done heaps and heaps of it. I mean, I think I'm not too bad at flying, but you become good by practice. You do not, I mean, because I've done a lot of check and training of pilots and some really experienced pilots, I know we're all human, no matter how clever you think you are. When you're learning something, we all get overloaded, we all make mistakes, no matter how clever you think you are. But if you're doing one thing all the time, you become very, very good at it. And that's how you become good at it. And I find a lot of the things I've done a lot of. If I'm doing a new thing, I definitely step back and take it extremely quietly and work through things very methodically, never take things for granted. In fact, I never take things for granted even when I'm flying something that I've flown a lot, because over the years you see experienced pilots still cock up and you think, how did that happen, you know? How did he do that? Well, we're all human, and if we have these lapses, you know, we can have incidents or accidents. So it's the grace of God go I. And the longer you fly, the more you realise that you're not invincible. When you're young, you think, man, I'm pretty damn good at this. I'm a hell of a lot smarter than that. Look what he did. That would never happen to me. But you realise in time that it can. Just because you're experienced and good at what you're doing doesn't mean it's not going to happen to you. So I think as I get older, I'm a lot more methodical than what I used to be, and I have a lot less cock-ups than I used to be, because you used to rely on your wits a lot more, and every now and again they'd let you down. Whereas you get a bit older and you realise that, you know, you're not as it's easy to have a lapse in concentration or get distracted, or you know, so you get a bit more methodical with what you do. But as far as flying different types, I mean, I don't have an issue with it. I mean, I can fly the helicopter one day or the same day, do a job in the morning into the hills, and then jump in my jet and fly to Auckland that day. And I don't find it difficult at all.
Because I know, you know, I've dealt with corporate client insurance policies that'll have a requirement that the captain has only flown one type maybe in the last 90 days. So there's obviously a perception that flying more than one type is not safe.
Yeah, well, I mean, if you're not doing it regularly and you're not current on that aircraft, yes, definitely. I mean, if you go and jump in something that you haven't flown for a long time and you've been flying one type, that's going to be dangerous. I take guys with me quite often when I'm flying, you know, in the jet, and pretty competent pilots, and I go, you work the radio, mate, and they can't even get the radio call out because, hey, this call is whatever it is, Romeo, Juliet, Zulu. Well, they'll just get on there, and they can't even say that because what comes out is what their motor skill is to what they're flying, let alone flying the aircraft, because that's all they do. It's different for me. I never get on the radio and just push the button and open my mouth. I always check the call sign against what it's going to be. Just normally for the first flight, after, you know, the first call of the day, and then it comes back to me, but I'm in the habit of doing that. So you're not calling your helicopter an aeroplane or your something else. So and every time I get in and I start it up before I hit the starter, especially on a turbine, I go, hang on a minute, I'm in this, because they all start differently. Some are FADEC, some you put fuel in first, some you don't, some you do this. And I always go, right, if this turns to custard, what's my way out of this without cooking that engine? I always think that before I hit the starter, because if some reason that engine decides to go hot, if I haven't pre-briefed myself on that, I could easily cook it. And I've seen it, experienced pilots cook engines. And that's one of my worst nightmares. I think, geez, I just don't want to be one of those guys who do it. But I can see how it happens. Just that brains disengage, it turns to custard, and then what am I going to do?
I think your first commercial helicopter job was flying an R44.
Well, the first one I flew was EC-130
okay.
with tallies, and that was sort of my way into the helicopter way, really, because I was flying their King Air, and they had that 130 doing tourist work. And I thought, well, if I get stuck in and get my helicopter license, I might be able to fly that. So I was lucky. I got my commercial license with about 80 hours, and I started on the EC-130, which was a good entry-level helicopter to start with. I mean, pretty easy to fly, plenty of power, you know, FADEC, all that stuff. It was pretty easy. But then I went to the 44,
Can you talk a bit about that 44 operation? Because, you know, I think that, from what I've heard, was a pretty challenging environment to work in. And also, can you talk a bit about Robinson helicopters and the press they have, safety issues or perceived safety issues?
Yeah, well, where we lived out of Marlborough up the Branch River, we had 50 acres up there. And I had the opportunity to fly a 44 and do a bit of a contra deal to get a few hours up in it. So I ended up using that a bit to fly into the hills and do a bit of hunting. And I realised that South Marlborough was a pretty good hunting area, and there was no one else doing it because of where we lived. We had pretty easy access, and from other places it was too hard to fly to, or too expensive. So once I realised there were some good hunting areas up there, I thought, shit, I could start flying hunters in, which was always my dream. And that's why I wanted to learn to fly. This is a familiar story
from most of your life. I had this great idea.
Yeah, I had this great idea. So, I started up there with an Astro 44, which is a carburetted one, which are quite good helicopters, but they don't like altitude. And unfortunately, where I had to land up there was pretty high, you know, up around 4,000 or 5,000 feet. So she'd start to run out of puff, she'd with a bit of load on, and you couldn't hover up there. It was lucky I was a fixed wing pilot, because that's how I had to fly my helicopter to make it land. If you dropped any airspeed, it would turn into a stone pretty quick. So the idea was to get to zero airspeed just as you hit the ground, and that worked okay most of the time. So that was what I started off doing. And yeah, I know that rolled a few eyes. There's a few guys, bloody fixed wing pilots up there, Australia, he's flying. Oh, he's not going to bloody last long. And then I think that was my determination. I thought, right, I'm going to show you bastards. I'm going to do my best not to crash this thing. So I started off with that, and yeah, it was a challenging environment, but you work through it. I mean, because I had a lot of experience, by then I had 10,000 hours of fixed wing flying, and I'd had a few frights and learned a few lessons about how far you pushed and needed to come back. So although I was a pretty novice helicopter pilot, I picked the brains of guys that I knew who had experience, and I just worked into it quietly and figured it out for myself, but never really pushed it too far. So I learned a technique to be able to land these guys on these ridges, at high altitude in the Astro, and also what loads I could and couldn't take, and dealing with the wind. I mean, that's the worst thing about Marlborough, the wind. It's bloody windy in there, and that was a bit of a challenge. But I mean, I was used to wind. I've bloody flown out of Wellington for years in those places, so I mean, I wasn't scared of wind. But and wind can be your friend if you can get it going the right way for you, and it can also be your enemy. So I mean, I knew with the fixed wing, how to pick my way up the windward side and cross ridges and not get in the lee and all that stuff. So I just persevered, and then ended up with a pretty good operation. I was doing a heap of hunters. I was flat out all year doing hunters, especially during the Raw, and I sort of built up that business to a pretty good business. I enjoyed it, but it was a bit like a lot of the other things that had turned into a bit of a monster. I had hunters ringing me all day, all night, and it got to the stage where I thought, I've done 10 years of this. I haven't come unstuck. I think it's time for a change. But it was one of the great box ticking exercises of my life. It was pretty cool. I mean, talk about living the dream.
Can you talk to your experience with the safety of flying Robinsons?
Yeah, well, they got bad press, haven't they? Oh, is that a Robinson? I'm not getting in that. I mean, in this country, they've got a shitty name. And
is it justified?
Well, commercially, I think they've got the best safety record out of any helicopter. Commercially, I don't think there's ever been a fatality in a Robinson. There's been a lot of training accidents and low-time pilot accidents. The pro Robinson people will say, well, that's because everyone's training in Robinsons. And that's probably true. If they're training other things, would those accidents still be there? Possibly, but they may be different types of accidents. Even people who don't know about helicopters know about mast bumping, because everyone knows about mast bumping. I mean, in all the times I flew them, and I used to fly them in some wind, I never ever felt any of that mast bumping, where the tail lifts up and it rolls over. I've never had that. But I was also really aware of the fact that if you didn't handle these helicopters right, they will bite you. And it's not that they can't fly in wind and turbulence. I think if you start, if they do get in that negative G situation and you pull power and the tail lifts up and it rolls you over, well, I think you're in trouble. So the secret is, don't ever let that happen.
I guess the question is if it takes a certain level of pilot skill that is, maybe more than the average, is that a safe helicopter, even though, some people can deal with it. Can everyone?
Well, what's a safe helicopter? Look, they're quite twitchy and they're grunty and they've got a really good tail rotor. So there's, if you mishandle them or over control in bad situations, I'm sure they'll bite you, and probably
as will any
pretty bloody
machine, whether it be a
any
flying
machine will,
or...
but probably the Robinson more so. Is that a case to ban them? No. Operate them the way they should be? Yes. But people do dumb stuff, don't they? You know, can we make everything idiot proof? You can't. I think the reputation they've got of being helicopters that fly to bits for no reason is complete bullshit, because they don't. But mishandle them or do something silly and they could bite pretty nastily. But so do a lot of flying machines, you know. They've all got their vices. Every flying machine I've flown will bite you if you're silly enough. The Bonanza I fly down here, V-tail Bonanza, that's a great little aircraft, but they were known as the fork-tailed doctor killer back in the day, because people used to rip the tails off and rip the wings off them, and they are very, you know, a bit like the Robinson. Fork-tailed doctor killer, don't go anywhere near one of those things. But people were getting out of a Cherokee or a Cessna into an aircraft that's real slippery and high performance, and you push the nose down on that and it'll go through V&E in a couple of seconds. So if you're not onto it, and then you get in V&E in a spiral descent and pull back on the stick, I'm sure your tail's going to be gone. So is that a fault of the aircraft, or it's the same thing? If you mishandle it, it'll bite you. Probably more so than your 172 that only goes 100 knots flat out.
Are all aviation accidents preventable? Or is the reality that as long as there's people and planes, there's going to be a certain amount of accidents? And I'm thinking of, you know, the MOT have this strategy called Road to Zero, I think. You know, 0 fatal accidents, or I think even serious accidents by 2030 is the goal, which personally I think is just stupid. You know, as long as there's people doing dumb things, which we see every day, in cars, there's going to be some accidents. Is that the same with aviation?
Well, I think of course it is. I mean, things like, you know, 0 accidents by 2030 or predator-free by 2050. I mean, they're nice things to say, but nobody believes it, do they? Because it's not going to happen. No, they're not, because you're dealing with humans, you're dealing with machinery. I mean, the machinery has definitely got better, hasn't it? You know, and but things happen. People make mistakes. Machinery fails, or parts of the machinery fail, and the humans make the mistake to make it worse. You know, it's, I mean, we can do our best, can't we? But I mean, stuff's going to happen, isn't it? You can do your best to not make it happen, but...
Can we talk about two words that I think you've mentioned a bit already? One, complacency, and 2, common sense. Can you teach common sense? And if so, how?
Well, I suppose, I mean, common sense is taught from when you're a kid, isn't it? From, you know, learning by your mistakes. I mean, when you're learning to drive or riding your first motorbike, you know, there's no fear there until hopefully you come off and don't hurt yourself too badly, don't break your back and finish up in a wheelchair, and you learn from that.
I think it's quite different than when you and I were kids to when it is now, because
that's the problem.
There's a large lack of learning abilities because we're so risk averse.
Well, we always try to blame someone else when something goes wrong. You know, if we stick our hand in the chipper and it gets chipped up, whose fault is that? Well, they didn't have a sign on the chipper to say, don't stick your hand in there, you know. Whereas you'd like to think that we know that we don't have to do that. You know, the warning on the cup of coffee to say, don't drink it, it might be hot. because if we do drink it, we burn our mouth. Well, it was the person's fault because he didn't have a label on it. And I think there's a certain amount of the generation now expecting society to protect them, and that if they do something, it's someone else's fault because nobody told them. Whereas we need to go, hey guys, you need to take a certain amount of responsibility for yourself and own up to stuff. If you're not doing things well, take the responsibility yourself. Don't say, oh, well, it's because he didn't train me properly or because he wasn't nice. We've got to take a bit of responsibility for ourselves and not try and blame everyone else for the fact that we've done something wrong or we're not succeeding.
What about complacency in aviation? What would you say to young people in the industry about, especially those with low time, about ways to combat being complacent?
Well, I think every time before you go flying, have a think about the task at hand, how you're going to deal with it. Take your time before, you might be worried that, one example might be you're heading off on a flight and where you're going, the weather's a little bit bad. Well, as a low-time pilot, that's going to be concerning to you. You're going to be worried about that. But because you're worried about that, it can take your focus off the other things that you also need to worry about. Your pre-flight, your walk around, all that stuff. So when you're in a situation, you're feeling that stress coming on you, which you're going to get often, just take a step back and methodically do things. Take 3 deep breaths. Don't ever hurry. I mean, be efficient, but don't, if you feel you're rushing, take a step back with it, doing your pre-flight checks, walk around, whatever. Take your time, because it might be the weather you're worried about there, but in the meantime, you're in too much of a hurry that you don't shut the bloody door and it flies open as you take off. And you think, oh God, I was so worried about the weather. Take your time. Have a think about what you're doing before you do it, because that is probably not your biggest hazard of the day.
What advice would you give to young people in general to have a satisfying and a successful life?
Jeepers, I don't know. When people ask me for advice now, I just say, look, I can't say what you should or shouldn't do. Try and be positive, try and be open. Realise that as humans we have the ability to get sucked into all sorts of stuff, and we all get trapped by it, whether it be religion, I don't know, anti-vax, pro-vax, or the people you associate with. It's very easy to get a view of that's what's right and the other people are wrong. Try to be able to take a step back and go, hang on a minute, I can see what these guys are saying, and man, they have got some good points, but why are these other guys saying the exact opposite? Maybe they've got some good points, and be able to look at both sides and go, yeah, actually, they're both sort of right, but they're a bit extreme on either side. Maybe somewhere in the middle is where it's at. I'm just amazed to see as humans how gullible we are. I mean, you think of a terrorist who straps some bombs on him and goes and blows up a whole lot of innocent people. That guy really believed that he was doing a good thing in his heart. He believed he was getting rid of the bad people and what he was doing was so right. And he believed that with all his heart. So you've got to look at that and go, how can that happen? Well, we are just influenced, whether it be, who we associate with. So try not to be too judgmental of other people. And when you're doing something, if you can take your eyes off yourself and put your eyes on the tasks that you're doing, opportunities will open up for you everywhere. They just do. Because, and then, you don't have to worry about yourself because it just works out for you. But if you're, thinking, well, hang on, what about me? What's in it for me? Or am I going to get a pay rise if I do this? But if you forget about that and go the other way, it will work out for you. I know that's not easy to do, but...
Have you got any regrets in life? Looking back over it all, would you do anything different if you could do it all again?
I don't think so. I mean, some of my regrets are when I was first in management, I think I was too tough on people. And that's just because I grew up with a reasonably authoritarian way. If we misbehaved, we got a bloody good kick up the arse, alkathene on the arse, or told to pull our bloody heads. And not that did me any harm, to be fair, it didn't, but I've learned over the years to get the best out of people. Yeah, you've got to get their respect so they won't walk all over you for sure, but you've also got to get them to come with you, and you've got to see to be caring about them to help you. So if you can help them grow, they will then work for you with enthusiasm. So one of my regrets is I think I was a little bit tough back in the day, but I've learned that that's not the best way to get the best results out of people.
I've got one last question.
Uh-oh.
Will you ever go and work for the CAA?
Well, I mean, I've got some good people I know who work for the CAA, and I think it's possibly a little bit like government. Not all politicians are assholes. I'm sure some of them have gone in there with the right intentions, but it's just a monster. If I felt I could go into CAA and make a difference, I would. But I don't think you could at the moment. I've seen a lot of good people blow out. They've tried, but the bureaucracy just kills them. But if maybe the culture changed in there, and I mean, it would be a nice thing to do, to be able to go into the industry and help. But I don't think I could make a difference at the moment. Not that I would write it off, but I think it'd do my head in at the moment.
That's it. Thanks very much.